You know that feeling, right? That deep intuition that your thoughts, your emotions, they're actually in the driver's seat making you do things.
Yeah, it feels absolutely fundamental.
It does, but what if that's just not how it works? What if our feelings are more like shadows, just tagging along?
That's exactly the unsettling but fascinating idea we're digging into today. We're looking at William James's article from 1879, Are We Automata?
1879, wow, so this isn't a new debate.
Not at all. And our mission in this deep dive is, well, pretty straightforward. Let's try and really get our heads around this conscious automaton theory he was tackling, and then explore his arguments against it.
Okay, conscious automaton theory. It sounds mechanical. Lay it out for us. What's the core concept?
Right. So, in essence, it argues that when it comes to our actual actions, the things we do, we're basically complex machines, material machines.
And our feelings, our consciousness.
They're seen as byproducts, side effects of whatever our nervous system is doing. Like that shadow idea, the shadow follows the person, but it doesn't make the person move. Feelings, in this view, have zero power to influence the brain activity that causes our behavior.
Zero power. So, okay, let's say I work hard and feel proud. The pride didn't actually, contribute to the hard work succeeding.
According to this theory, no. It suggests the flow of our thoughts and feelings. Feeling motivated leads to action. Disappointment leads to sadness. That sequence isn't really causal in that direction.
So what dictates the sequence then?
It's the underlying nerve processes. The order they fire in determines the order your thoughts and feelings appear in. They run in parallel, maybe, but the feeling isn't pushing the nerves around.
That's pretty counterintuitive. Who was pushing this idea back then?
James points to some big names. Professor Huxley was a major voice for it. Also D.A. Spalding, Professor Clifford. They saw it as pretty fundamental.
Interesting.
And James actually credits another philosopher, Mr. Hodgson, with giving the sort of earliest and clearest breakdown of the whole theory.
Okay, you mentioned Huxley. It's kind of strange, isn't it, that someone like him, arguing for this machine-like view, also bought into Hume's idea about causality. Could you remind us what Hume said? Because they seem almost opposed.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle, James highlights. Hume basically argued that when we see cause and effect out in the world, like one billiard ball hitting another, we don't actually perceive some necessary connection.
Okay.
What we perceive is just constant conjunction, one thing following another. The feeling of necessity, Hume thought, comes from inside our own minds, from how one thought seems to automatically lead to the next. We then project that internal feeling onto the external world.
Right. So if you're skeptical about that internal feeling of necessity, like Hume was.
Exactly. Then it gets tricky to explain how we even form the concept of cause and effect to apply to the physical world. So, yeah, James notes there's a bit of tension there for someone like Huxley holding both views.
Okay, so despite that tension, what was the evidence or reasoning pushing Huxley towards this automaton view?
Well, James explains that Huxley leaned heavily on observations of reflex actions. The classic example is the decapitated frog.
Oh, right. The frog that still wipes acid off its back even without a brain?
Precisely. It performs these seemingly complex, even rational actions. Huxley's leap was, well, if that kind of complex behavior can happen without a brain, and presumably without consciousness, maybe the apparent purposefulness of our own actions doesn't actually need conscious feelings driving them either.
So the intricate wiring is enough.
That was the idea, that the neural circuitry could handle it all automatically. Though, it's worth mentioning, James notes that Mr. Lewes, another thinker at the time, disagreed. He thought some kind of feeling, even if not conscious, must be involved.
It really sounds like they were striving for a tidier picture, a clean separation between mind and body.
James definitely suggests that. He talks about an aesthetic demand, particularly maybe among scientists working in labs. A desire to keep explanations purely physical, mechanical, without getting tangled up in messy things like feelings.
Easier to measure and control, I guess.
Right. Some apparently even viewed consciousness as just too vague, maybe even non-existent for scientific purposes. Just stick to the observable brain stuff.
But doesn't that just clash so hard with our everyday feeling? Our common sense?
Absolutely. And James says common sense has its own aesthetic demand, a desire for unity, for connection. The idea that our rich inner life, our thoughts, feelings, choices, are just inert, powerless. That feels deeply wrong, unsatisfying to most of us. We feel like we matter.
So you've got these two strong pulls, these two aesthetic demands. How do you decide between them?
Well, James basically says back in 1879, at least, you couldn't settle it with pure logic or just by saying, my intuition feels better than yours. Both views were, possible ways of framing reality.
So dead end.
Not quite. He suggests shift in tactics. Instead of looking for absolute proof, let's look for circumstantial evidence. Little clues, indirect hints that might tip the balance one way or the other, move us beyond just, prejudice.
Okay, circumstantial evidence. What's the big piece he puts forward?
His main line of argument revolves around evolution. Think about it. Consciousness exists. It's complex. It seems to have developed over evolutionary time, just like our eyes or hearts.
Right. Features usually evolve because they're useful.
Exactly. So if consciousness was just a useless byproduct, a supernumerary, as James puts it basically, an extra part with no function, like the automaton theory suggests, why would evolution have bothered? Why select for it? Why develop it? It doesn't make sense from a Darwinian perspective.
That is a strong point. Evolution is usually pretty efficient. It doesn't tend to keep things around that offer no survival advantage.
Precisely. So James flips the question. If consciousness did evolve, what is its use? What advantage does it give a nervous system?
Okay, so how does a brain with consciousness maybe work better than one without?
To get at that, James asks us to think about a key characteristic, maybe even a defect, of highly evolved nervous systems like ours.
A defect.
Well, compared to simpler systems, our responses aren't rigidly fixed. There's a lack of determinateness. Remember the headless frog versus a whole frog? The headless one reacts predictably. The whole frog, much less so.
More flexible, but less predictable.
Exactly. James calls it a kind of vagueness. This allows us to adapt to incredibly subtle changes in our environment, things a simple reflex machine couldn't handle. Our complex brain is in a state of what he calls unstable equilibrium. A tiny input can trigger wildly different responses. Think of a raindrop hitting a mountain ridge. Which way will it flow?
So complexity brings adaptability, but also uncertainty, fallibility.
Yes, it's a trade-off. You can have a nervous system that's simple and almost infallibly does its few things, or one that's complex, adaptable, but prone to making mistakes. A high brain's actions can seem almost like a happy-go-lucky hit-or-miss affair, as he puts it.
Okay, I see the problem. Now, how does consciousness step in to, improve the odds in this hit-or-miss situation?
This is where it gets really interesting. James points out that as soon as we start talking about useful discharge or appropriate direction or making things more efficient, we're smuggling in an idea.
Which is?
The idea of a good, an end, or an interest for the organism, survival, flourishing, achieving a goal, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But James argues that in a purely physical world, a world without any consciousness, these concepts have no meaning.
How so? Matter just is.
Right. Physical processes just happen according to laws. There's no inherent good or bad for a bunch of atoms. The very act of comparing different possibilities, judging one outcome as better than another, requires, as James puts it, a forum. It requires consciousness.
A forum, like a place where different ideas or outcomes can be brought together and weighed against each other.
Exactly. He makes a subtle point. A succession of feelings is different from a feeling of succession. To compare things, to feel that one thing leads to another meaningfully, requires consciousness, a kind of awareness that can hold multiple items in view and relate them.
So using words like use, advantage, interest, good, it only makes sense if there's a conscious perspective valuing those things.
That's his argument. Without consciousness, those terms are meaningless. Even something like truth needs a mind to recognize it as true, to value it. He gives the example of Bismarck's brain versus a suicidal maniac's brain. Physically, they're just complex arrangements of matter. Without a conscious standard judging their outputs, you can't say one is inherently better or more valuable than the other.
Okay, but what about Darwinian evolution? Doesn't that posit survival, self-preservation, as a kind of universal good that arises mechanically?
Good point. Darwinian thought does explain how processes leading to survival can be selected for mechanically, without any conscious intention within the process itself. But James is asking something slightly different, which is if consciousness emerges and can recognize survival as valuable, if it can compare different paths and judge which one seems better for survival, could its ability to make those judgments, its causal efficacy, actually help achieve that goal more effectively than purely blind mechanical processes alone?
Can consciousness give the system a better aim, essentially?
That's the question. Can it improve the odds in that hit-or-miss affair of the complex brain? And this leads him to what he sees as the core function of consciousness.
What she defines as
Comparison, judgment, but ultimately, selection. He emphasizes the profound mystery of interest and selective attention.
selective attention, meaning we focus on some things and ignore others.
Yes, constantly. Consciousness isn't just a passive recipient of information, it's actively choosing. It accentuates some experiences, suppresses others. This happens at every level.
Can you give some examples?
Think about your senses. Your ears pick up sound waves within a certain range, ignoring others. Your eyes pick up certain frequencies of light. Each sense organ is already performing a massive act of selection, carving out a specific slice of reality from an overwhelming continuum of physical events. We experience distinct sounds and colors, but the underlying physical reality might be much smoother.
So our senses create contrasts by
Right.
filtering.
In a way, yes. They select what gets through, and then attention does another layer of selecting from what the senses provide. Helmholtz, the physicist and physiologist, showed how many sensations, especially visual ones, are technically available to us, but we just don't notice them unless we specifically direct our attention there.
We filter out the noise.
We filter out almost everything. James argues even basic perception involves a twofold choice. First, from the sensations hitting us now, we select certain absent sensations that they imply, like seeing a corner of a table makes you perceive the whole table. And then from all those possible implied sensations, we select a few as representing the objective reality. You see a table as square. Even though the image on your retina is rarely a perfect square depending on your angle, your mind selects the squareness.
So perception itself is an act of choosing and interpretation.
Very much so. And this carries through to everything else. Our habits of attention determine what we notice in the world, what we remember from an experience. Think of two people touring Europe, one focused on art, the other on food. They experience and remember vastly different things.
Right, they've selected different aspects of the same reality.
Exactly. And it applies to reasoning, picking out the relevant factors from the irrelevant ones. To aesthetics, the artist selects elements to create harmony. And crucially, to ethics, choice is the absolute core of ethics, choosing which goals, which interests, become the guiding ones.
Wow. So James sees selection, driven by interest and attention, as the fundamental activity of consciousness.
That's the thrust of it. He paints the mind as this stage filled with possibilities, buzzing with potential experiences and thoughts. Consciousness, acting through attention, is like a sculptor. It doesn't create the marble the raw sensory input is given, but it actively carves away, selects, suppresses, and shapes that raw material into the meaningful statue of our experience.
So we started with this tension, the gut feeling that our consciousness matters versus the cold, mechanistic automaton theory.
Right. The theory that says feelings are just exhaust fumes.
And James, by looking at evolution, the hit-or-miss nature of complex brains, and this pervasive role of selective attention, he makes a case that consciousness isn't just fumes.
Precisely. He argues that the circumstantial evidence points strongly towards consciousness having real causal efficacy. Its ability to select, to focus, to hold goals in mind, likely does help navigate the complexities of life more effectively. It makes the common sense view that our awareness guides us seem much more plausible than the idea we're just puppets watching the show.
It definitely leaves you thinking, that feeling of focusing your attention, of consciously choosing what to think about or what path to take. Does that feel like an illusion to you?
It's a powerful question. James's argument really pushes us to consider our own subjective experience. Are we just passively witnessing the output of our neuromachinery? Or is that feeling of active selection, of interest, shaping our reality, actually pointing to something real about how we work? Are we along for the ride? Or is our conscious awareness genuinely helping to steer? Something to definitely keep exploring.